Good evening. Welcome to the Majors and Quinn YouTube channel. My name is Annie. I'm the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn, which is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you are familiar with us, if you've been to our virtual events before, welcome back. Thank you for being here. If you are tuning in for the first time, thank you so much for your interest in this event. We're very excited to have author Elly Fishman in store today to talk to Lara Dreyer about her new book, Refugee. We are going to hear a conversation between Elly and Lara, and then you will have the opportunity to ask some questions. If you're watching on YouTube, so there is a live chat function. You should let us know where you're watching from, say hello, and also at any point in the broadcast, if you want to put your question in there, we will take some questions at the end of the hour. We do have copies of Refugee High available to buy at Majors and Quinn, of course, and I will put the phone number for the store that you can give us a call tonight and order one. We do ship anywhere in the US and internationally, and we also have next day pickup. So if you are calling from the Twin Cities area, you can come pick it up at the store. We are also open 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. So if you just want to walk in without ordering ahead, that is fine too. Thank you so much for supporting an independent bookstore with your purchase, if that's what you choose to do today. And I am going to introduce our wonderful speakers and let them get on with the show. So first off, we have author Elly Fishman, who worked as a senior editor and writer at Chicago Magazine. Her features have won numerous awards, including our City Regional Magazine Award for her article, Welcome to Refugee High, her first report on the students and faculty at Chicago's Roger C. Sullivan High School. Refugee High, Coming of Age in America, from the New Press, is based on that article and won the prestigious Studs and Ida Turkle Prize for first book in public interest. A Chicago native and graduate of the University of Chicago, Fishman currently lives in Milwaukee with her husband and their dog and teaches in the journalism department at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you so much, Elly, for being here. And then in conversation with her, we have Lara Dreyer, an avid reader who has 15 years experience in education-based nonprofits that focus on making our educational system more accessible and equitable for students of all backgrounds. She holds a BA from University of Minnesota in sociology and an MBA from Augsburg University. Thank you so much, Lara, for being the interviewer for this event tonight. I cannot wait to hear this conversation, and I will be back to help take questions at the end of the hour. Enjoy.
Thank you, Annie, for that lovely introduction, and Lara for being here as part of this conversation, and to everyone out there in the internet. Thank you for being here as well. I thought I would start with a brief reading from Refugee High, which I have here. So in the book, I follow 4 students over the course of a school year at Roger C. Sullivan High School in Rogers Park, which is the northeastern corner of the city. And these 4 students come from all corners of the globe, one from Iraq, one from Myanmar, one from Guatemala, and one student from the Congo. And I thought I would start with a reading about the student from the Congo. So the first chapter is the first day of school, and this is Belenge's first day inside Sullivan High School. So this is the introduction to Belenge in Refugee High. Belenge. Pausing just inside the metal detectors, Belenge, who has arrived with his younger brother, Asani, stands frozen at the edge of the Sullivan hallways. The fast-moving stream of students bends around the boys. Belenge and Asani are no strangers to chaos. They were raised in a world colored by makeshift shelters and scarcity of wood, food, and water. Like many young Congolese refugees, the two were born as stateless citizens in the only hospital inside Nyarugusu, the sprawling refugee camp in Kigoma, Tanzania. They grew up among more than 150,000 people without a place to call home. But here, in the hallways of Sullivan, where the crowds of students include groups of tall, broad-shouldered Syrian teenagers, pairs of girls in headscarves and trench coats, and kids with Apple headphones and pristine Jordans, Belenge does not yet understand his place in the school's social order. Belenge has been anticipating his first day of school all summer. He picked out red track pants and a black striped jacket for his first day outfit. He arrived in Chicago 12 months ago and spent last year at the nearby Senn High School. There, he sat in the back of regular classes. Belenge, who still struggles to communicate and express himself in English, couldn't follow the lessons. He also found the rigid structure, long hours, strict attendance policies, nightly homework frustrating. Everything overwhelmed Belenge when he first arrived in the United States. Belenge and his family had never lived in an apartment. He never had electricity, nor seen a 3-story building. He'd never used a refrigerator or walked into a room full of books. He'd never seen snow or worn a winter coat. Cell phones and social media were novel too, but enrolling at a new school introduced Belenge to a new social anxiety, fitting in. The 16-year-old discovered that strangers often assumed he was Black American, but to Belenge, Black students were just as foreign to him as any of his other American classmates. Not long after Belenge and Asani arrive at Sullivan, a youth manager joins them. She's from Refugee One, the resettlement agency that helped Belenge and his family establish their lives in Chicago. Taking a few steps into the hallway, the counselor shepherds the brothers towards the library. Inside, Belenge spots a coterie of Bembe Congolese families in the corner. His entire body relaxes and he smiles, revealing a set of brilliant white teeth. Among the group, Belenge sees his friend Asengo and Felix. Both boys are also from Niragusu. Asengo sits with his sister, whose feet are squeezed into high heels and whose eyes and cheekbones are accentuated by thick makeup. She looks like a soap opera star. Felix, who started at Sullivan last year, nods to Belenge. Felix's English is good, thanks to hours spent watching American movies, listening to pop music, and reading American books. Belenge figures Felix probably knows every lyric to every Justin Bieber song by now. Felix and Belenge make a plan to walk home together. The two are neighbors now that Belenge's father moved his family next door to Felix's family's apartment. Belenge's father, Tobias, works long hours, and when he isn't working, he drinks. Felix's mother, Sakina, who everyone calls Mama Sakina, looks after Belenge and his siblings. She makes them fufu in the afternoon and spends the evening braiding Belenge's sister's hair. In an environment where everything remains new, Mama Sakina offers Belenge some sense of stability. After greeting his friends, Belenge takes a seat in the library. A student explains, in Swahili, that he needs to wait for his schedule. Belenge settles in. He doesn't mind waiting. He's used to it. In Niragusu, the average family remains in the camp for 17 years before they are resettled somewhere new. Waiting is part of life. So that's Belenge on his first day of school at Sullivan.
Thank you so much, Elly. It's so exciting to talk to you about this book. I loved reading it. And I was hoping that we could start the conversation by hearing a little bit of the background on how you came about writing this book. So I understand that you are a journalist by trade, and you could have chosen a lot of different ways to explore the refugee experience. And one of the things that struck me is that this is not a book that's full of statistics or tries to generalize the refugee experience in any way. You're not making a policy argument about immigration in the US, but what you do choose to do is to lean into these individual student narratives. And I'm wondering if you can tell us just a little bit more about how the idea for this book came together and why you settled on the approach that you did.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always, as a writer and as a journalist, interested in the stories of people and putting the voices of people, and particularly young people, front and center, and using my platform, which I feel so lucky to have, to help young people and all kinds of people do that. I also am not a policy expert and, felt like I maybe wasn't the best person to make a policy argument. So also just playing to my strengths as a storyteller. But I also wanted to put a human face to an issue that is often written about through policy or data points or statistics, and both from the educational lens and the immigration and refugee lens, and really show lives lived on the ground. And that really emerged from a question I asked myself back in 2017, which feels like both a long time ago and not that long ago in a strange way, after Donald Trump was inaugurated and he announced a travel ban from 7 majority Muslim countries in January 2017. And I went to a protest at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. And I was surrounded by thousands of people who were there to protest this draconian new executive order. And not only was I moved by, everyone who was surrounding me and curious who they were, but standing there at the airport, that like the physical building and space, I wondered, who are these families arriving here who are stuck on the other side of these walls in front of me, or these glass doors in front of me? And I wanted to know who they were and what their experiences were and where they landed in Chicago in particular. And that drove me to look for refugee communities in Chicago. And I had always been interested in stories of young people because I just love how they forecast our future, how they see the world, how they're full of hope. And when you think about young people, you think about schools. And I was pretty quickly pointed towards Sullivan, which is the neighborhood school in Rogers Park, in Chicago, where many, if not the majority of refugees are resettled in the city. So that's where this whole project began. And here we are, however many years later. And I'm still so moved by the stories I continue to hear from these students. And it feels really important to continue to highlight them and to offer space to share them. So that's why I took this approach.
That's great. And one of the things that really struck me is it was clear that you took a lot of care in choosing which stories to highlight, even though you were really focusing in on just a handful of individuals. Collectively, they really do paint a picture of the diversity of the refugee experience. Like you mentioned, each of the students that you highlight in the book comes from a different part of the world. They're all balancing different family customs with American culture. They're all navigating different parts of the immigration process. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the research and writing process in terms of how you decided which student stories to lift up. How did you go about building trust with students and their families? And then how did the stories ultimately come together?
Yeah, so it was an intentionally slow process. It did start with an article in Chicago Magazine because I was an editor there at the time. And after I found out about Sullivan, I basically cold called the front office and talked to Chad Adams, the principal in the book, who invited me to his school, which, is not always how it goes when you call and talk to a principal. He's a very cool guy. He kind of looks like a rocker, and he in fact is in a rock band. He's not at all what you expect a principal, like a buttoned up principal, to look like. And when I first visited the school, I was so overwhelmed by what I encountered. There are 40 languages inside Sullivan. Kids come from over 35 different countries. It's just this incredible quilt of languages and fashions and colors and flags. And there are innumerable incredible stories inside Sullivan. But I also was aware that I was an outsider and coming in, and wanted to be really sensitive to how I approached telling these stories and getting to know these young people. So I actually spent, a couple weeks at least, just being a fly on the wall in the ELL, so in the English language learner classrooms, so kids could get used to me. I became more of a familiar face, so they felt comfortable asking me questions. And some of the teachers even had me do like icebreaker exercises. So one was called Hot Seat, where I was put in the front of the room with like a bucket of candy, and students were encouraged to ask me questions. So they would ask me about my career, about where I grew up, was I married, you know, kind of the basic biographical questions that I in turn would ask them too. And I would respond and then like throw them a piece of candy. This is pre-COVID, obviously. And we did a lot of that just to sort of start to build trust. And over time, what that revealed to me was which students were interested in me, which students were interested in my project, because they would come up to me, you know, like during their lunch periods or after class and want to continue the conversation. And that gave me a sense of who might be a good subject for their original story. So I ended up writing about 3 students in the original article, most of whom, if not all of whom, graduated by the time I started reporting the book in earnest the following fall. But because I had been in the school and had built relationships with students, when I came back in the fall, kids kind of knew me already. And actually, one of the coolest things is like when you have a student who knows you and they'll vouch for you with their friends, that's like the best way in, right? So the kids I knew would bring me around in the cafeteria or the library, and they'd be like, "Oh, this is Elly. She's a writer. She's cool. Like you should talk to her." And there's no better guide than a student guide. Plus, you know, like you're in a high school, you can feel awkward. Maybe you're not wearing the right thing. Maybe you're not saying the right thing. And teenagers are like intimidating in their own way. And so to have like a student vouching for you is a very helpful thing. But I still wanted to be really intentional and take the process slowly again. So I kind of repeated the same thing, you know, getting to know students over time, seeing who was interested in the projects, seeing who seemed open to it. And that was a good kind of first measure of, okay, who might be part of this project or want to be part of this project. And then I also wanted to pick a group of students who represented how diverse the school is and represented how diverse the resettlement process can be. I mean, it's so layered and nuanced and complicated, and it's such an emotional roller coaster for kids. And there's so many, it looks so many different ways. And I wanted to have a set of characters who could represent that and would allow me to dig into some of these issues. So I follow 2 boys and 2 girls, and as I mentioned, who are from very different parts of the world and bring very different experiences to the table, and all of whom sort of have their own hopes and dreams and struggles that offer some kind of prism into these issues that so many young people are challenged by, both as refugees and just as teenagers, because at the end of the day, they're also just teenagers who want boyfriends, who watch scary movies, who go to the mall, you know, and I wanted to make sure that that was part of the story too.
Yeah, and that was something that really struck me is though your focus was so specifically on, you know, a small group of students in this very specific place and time, right, at Sullivan High School in Chicago, the themes felt really universal in a lot of ways to me. My professional background is, as Annie mentioned, is in nonprofits focused on educational equity in the Twin Cities, where we have a number of really large, vibrant immigrant communities. For instance, we have the largest Somali population outside of Somalia living in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Also, as sort of an interesting coincidence, one of the Congolese students in your book, the one that you highlighted in your reading, Belenge, at the end of the book ends up relocating to a small city in Wisconsin called Appleton, which is where I happen to have grown up. So,
Oh, I didn't know
and
that.
it's where my mom was a public school educator and
Wow.
administrator for 40 years. And so they have also seen dramatically shifting demographics over the past couple of decades. And so just from my own experience, working with students in St. Paul and Minneapolis, and through my connections with Appleton, I can see how resonant these themes are across the country. And so I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts on, as you were experiencing and researching this book, what were some of the themes that you would lift up as, potentially being most resonant with folks even outside of Chicago?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And Appleton is so interesting. There is, so Belenge does end up eventually in Appleton, as do many of the Congolese families who first landed in Chicago. And there is this growing Congolese community in Appleton, which is not really where you would expect a Congolese refugee community to land, but it's more affordable than Chicago. They have access to land, even just small parcels of land that they can farm, which is something that gives them a lot of joy and makes them feel like they have agency kind of over where they live. And that's often how it goes, right? Like one or two families move and then more follow. And so there's been this migration from Chicago to Appleton. I've been up there a few times to see them. So that's really interesting. But in terms of the universal themes, I mean, of course, this book is set in Chicago. There is so much you can learn about Chicago, I hope, through this book. But Sullivan is also an example of the kind of place that exists in so many cities, like the Twin Cities, across America and across the globe, where there are immigrant populations, refugee populations, where there are migrant populations. Kids go to school, and they go to schools like Sullivan. And what I found inside the building at Sullivan, I think, forecasts so many things that I'm sure are unfolding all across the country. Among them, thinking about how much trauma young people are carrying, especially right now, after 18 months away from school. That's certainly been on my mind, and how, we can learn from places like Sullivan, who really prioritize social emotional learning, or SEL curriculum, how students need, whether they grew up a block from school or thousands of miles from the school where they now find themselves, how much support they need, and that they need safe spaces and they need to be cared for. And, in order to academically succeed, you have to think about the student kind of holistically. It goes back to that sort of human lens, a human lens on education and educational success, and also raises questions about what success looks like. Also, what it means to be a sanctuary school in a sanctuary city, and the kind of joys and burdens that comes with that. I mean, we ask a lot of schools like Sullivan. They're often one of the only safety nets that exist for these kids. So there's often a heavy burden on places like Sullivan. And I think that's true for so many schools, especially public schools. One of the wonderful things about reporting this book is I spent a lot of time with the principal, Chad Adams, and also Sarah Quintens, who runs the ELL program at Sullivan. And Sarah is, with Chad, I mentioned he's like kind of got this rock star vibe, but he really, he has his own interesting story, which is that he came from an assistant principalship in one of Chicago's roughest neighborhoods, and a school, Harper High School, on the south side of the city, where one year alone he lost 29 students to gun violence. And when he arrives at Sullivan, he's processing his own PTSD, and from coming out of that, from seeing students killed and losing students. And it makes him a really unique leader for a place like Sullivan, and a really empathetic leader. And he, there's a trickle down effect in that, and leading with empathy and thinking about what, school as a healing space as much as an educational space. And then there's Sarah Quintens, who similarly, in her time at Sullivan, has weathered a lot of difficult transitions, from divorce and breaking her family apart to being a single mom. And you really see how she relies on the students as much as they rely on her. And in both the case of Sarah and Chad, Sullivan exemplifies how important those relationships are. When they talk about trauma-informed teaching, they talk about how important it is for kids to have relationships with adults in the building. And that sits so much at the heart of a place like Sullivan. And I think that's a lesson that should be taken to heart in schools and all kinds of spaces all over the country.
That was something that really stood out to me. And I think you mentioned this, but Chad Adams has stated that he wanted to make Sullivan the school for refugees coming to Chicago. And because of that, he ends up building out this really robust English language program, as well as curriculum, like you said, that's responsive to students who have experienced trauma. And there was an observation in the book that I thought was really poignant, which was that no matter how many drills or rules or peace circles he runs, the world doesn't stop at the doors of a school. And the book is really brimming with ways that the staff at Sullivan go far, far beyond what you might think of as sort of the domain of traditional education. They host a Thanksgiving meal to help teach students about different aspects of American culture. They teach students how to operate the doorbell systems in apartment buildings. They teach them about safe sex. And so I'm curious about whether your own ideas about that sort of blurry line between traditional education and curriculum and, sort of keeping students safe and whole, whether that evolved over time or how you thought about that during the research of this book.
Yeah, I think, I never visited Sullivan before Chad got there. He started his principalship in 2013, and I started my reporting in 2017. But that's definitely an ethos he brought to the building, and something that he learned at Harper too. And it was really important to him to create a restorative school. So one that really in every way kind of looks at healing rather than more punitive forms of discipline. And that has, I think, only grown as the conversation has evolved over the last several years. And it's very much part of how Chad talks about the school, talks about the spaces he wants to build inside the school. But, it's a big lift for a small school. And one of the things that Chad also does really well is he understands that a school is part of a community, and you can't, a school alone can't offer everything to students. And so he's really good at identifying other resources in the neighborhood to help with that. So there are tons of programs inside Sullivan that kind of run themselves on their own as long as they have space. So Emoja is one, which they run peace circles. There's another one called Becoming a Man, which is a citywide program where they work mostly specifically with boys on, emotion regulation and anger management, and really allowing them space to talk about their feelings. And they also, in the case of refugee and immigrant kids, they work really closely with the resettlement agencies, the 5 resettlement agencies in the neighborhood, to make sure that, they're getting the full picture of a kid, and a kid has access and awareness of the social services available to them, both inside and outside the building. And Sullivan is in this incredible neighborhood, Rogers Park, where there is kind of an amazing community that seems to rise up around the school. Like I did an event there a couple weeks ago, and the Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky was there. She's actually a Sullivan alum, and she came like in her Sullivan sweatshirt, and something like over 100 people showed up just to celebrate the school and celebrate these kids who are their neighbors. And there's such a sense of neighborliness in Rogers Park. And I think Sullivan also has this amazing alumni network who are so dedicated to the school and to connecting with the students who are there. And so it's very much part of this bigger ecosystem, which I think allows it to do this work, especially as those kinds of services, especially mental health services, are increasingly stripped away. And even just today, I was talking to someone who said, we're in two pandemics right now. We're in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're also in a mental health pandemic. There's a huge shortage of services met with the biggest need they've ever seen among young people. And schools are a huge part of that, especially in terms of preventative work, especially when you have big refugee and immigrant populations. Half of Sullivan are refugee or immigrant kids, but it's not enough. We can't ask schools to do all that work on their own. So it necessarily also has to change as the world is changing, as we're in a pandemic, which certainly no one could have predicted that when I started or when Chad started at Sullivan. But they seem really smart about how they remain nimble and continue to look for resources to make school not only kind of an institution that stands on its own and offers these services, but is part of this broader network and community too.
That's so great. Really inspiring to hear about everyone in the neighborhood sort of coming together and providing different services to ensure people have the wraparound resources they need. I don't want to lose the opportunity to ask you about some of the individual students in the book. And so the first student I wanted to ask you about is Alejandro. And I thought in particular, it was helpful for me to gain a better understanding of different students were at different places in the immigration process. And all of the refugee students in your book had come to the US from difficult circumstances, but then some of them had this additional layer of complexity where they were unsure whether they'd be able to stay. And, and that was sort of on top of the just general teenage adjustment and adjustment to the US that all of the students in the book shared. And so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about Alejandro's story, who really exemplifies that particular moment.
Yeah, so Alejandro is actually an asylum seeker from Guatemala. So he came as an unaccompanied minor and made that really harrowing journey from Guatemala City, where he was being targeted by MS-13, the now notorious gang that, has a chokehold on much of South and Central America, through Mexico and over the Texas border. And I wanted to tell his story not only because it's incredibly harrowing and he's a really special person, but also because it highlights some of the kind of legal distinctions between coming as a refugee and coming as an asylum seeker. And, of course, all four kids in the book are carrying heavy burdens, but Alejandro in particular, his future is in limbo. So you find out relatively early in the book that his second and final plea for asylum is set for just 3 days before he's set to graduate from Sullivan. And in addition to just being a teenager, wanting to find your place, wanting to win your next soccer game, he's a soccer player, wanting to connect with your family and take care of your girlfriend. This question of, can I even stay in this country? Can I continue this life that I've built for myself? Is hanging over him. And it's so hard to process what that means for a young person. And of course, there are so many people who carry that with them in this country. So that's sort of the arc that you follow with Alejandro, is what his life looks like as this big question mark is hanging over him over the course of the school year.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. And one of the things I loved about the book is that you focus in on these four main students, but then there are all of these sort of touch points with other students too, and you get to know bits and pieces of their stories. And so I also wanted to ask you about Samir, because for folks that are in higher ed, the concept of non-traditional students, I think, is pretty well known. But for folks who aren't in that area, it generally refers to students who didn't go directly to college after high school and therefore are generally a bit older than their peers. But I think it's less common to acknowledge what I guess we would call non-traditional high school students. I don't know if that's how it's referred to, but in the book there's a character named Samir who actually had attended high school already in Syria. And he was unable to gather his documents when he fled the country. And so he's having to repeat, I don't know if it was some or all of high school after he arrived at Sullivan. So I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about his story as well.
Yeah, so Samir is one of a wave of Syrian students who arrived starting in 2016, kind of on the heels of the Syrian war. And he, like many of the Syrian refugees, had gone through school and had, as you mentioned, had to leave the country without his documents. And he actually ended up in Egypt for a few years, where Syrians weren't eligible to go to public free school. So if you wanted to go to school, high school or college, you had to pay for it. And, these are families who fled with nothing. And that was pretty improbable. And even for those who could afford it, they faced a lot of discrimination, and many of them didn't last long in schools in Egypt. And in Samir's case, he had to work to support his family in Egypt. And so when he gets here in 2016, he had to basically start over in high school, which is not fun if you are not, high school's hard no matter what, but it's definitely not fun if you've already done it. But he, the school they don't really have a choice unless he could get his documents. So part of his story is just that struggle of knowing that this is kind of the path that he has to take in order to get to where he wants to be in the US. But it is really hard for him to be in school because he's older. He's also working 2 to 3 jobs to support his family. And he's ready to live his life and move on. And that, whether the students at Sullivan are older or not, many of them play a variety of roles like Samir in their families. They end up kind of being parents to their parents, and they work often more than one job, and they look after their younger siblings, and they are translators at doctor's visits and at the grocery store, and so many different circumstances for their parents, because they're learning English so much faster than their parents are, and they're in school. And so you can imagine, for so many of these young people, it's hard. It's hard to show up to school every day, be in class all day, doing homework, going immediately from school to work. And you see this in Samir's story and that kind of challenge, that constant challenge. But you see it in a lot of the young people's stories too. And it's something that I encountered over and over again in the reporting.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And there was another theme that sort of came up again and again that was a layer of complexity in the lives of these students that I wanted to ask you about, and that's marriage. And that was a topic that seemed to loom really large across a number of the stories about the female identified students in the book. And several of the stories include students who either are entering or have narrowly avoided arranged marriages while still in high school. Sarah, who you mentioned earlier, is the director of the ELL program, sort of thinks of marriage as one of the primary threats to her students being able to finish their diplomas on time. So this was something that just seemed really, really present and really heavy in a lot of the stories. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept too?
Yeah, so this was a shock to me, I have to say, when I started reporting the book. And I have reported on and out of a number of high schools and on young people and young women in particular in a variety of circumstances, and I had never encountered anything like this before. And what it is it's often kind of a generational battle and a cultural battle between high school girls and their parents. And in the case of one student who I follow in the book, Shahina, her story kind of starts after she's basically clawed her way out of an arranged marriage that was against her will. And when I learned this story, I really wanted to understand how that could even unfold, how a school responds to something like that. And these are not legal marriages. There's no documentation. They're religious marriages. So even if it's technically illegal to marry your 15-year-old daughter, if it's a religious marriage, there's not much you can do. There's not much intervention you can provide. And this is something that Sarah encounters over and over again. And when she talks about the things that she really carries home with her and cannot shake, it's these teenage marriages. So it's happening more than you realize inside Sullivan. And oftentimes the teachers only find out when it's too late, by the time the girls are gone. So what they've tried to start doing is identifying, the kind of breadcrumbs before the girls are gone for good. And once they're married, for the most part, they don't come back to school. They often are living somewhere else outside Chicago and soon expected to be a wife and a mother and a homemaker. So getting a high school diploma and going to college is not really part of that narrative in these cases. But so in the case of Shahina, I absolutely wanted to understand what had unfolded. But in the book, I also the main structure of the book is a year inside the school, but there are these 4 kind of interlude chapters that are set out of time and tell the backstories of each of these kids. And in most of the cases, it also tells the story of their parents. And in Shahina's case, it tells the story of her mother. And part of that decision on my part was I also wanted to understand how a mother could make that choice and how a mother might think that was the right choice for their daughter. And I really wanted to try and explore that and understand that. So that perspective is also in the book. And, part of it is these families did not choose to leave their home countries. They they did not choose to come to the United States. And some of these decisions that from the outside can look so draconian, so awful, so hard to understand, are actually ways that in some ways they think they're protecting their children from the unknown. And I spent time with their families and in their homes in order to try and understand where that was coming from and where those motivations were coming from. So that's also in there as part of the story too.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just get maybe a little bit of an update, if you have one, on the Sullivan team. So at the end of the book, you end with sharing that they've seen a significant decline in the number of new refugee students coming, which is as a result of the immigration caps instated by the Trump administration, which was causing concern for the team on a couple of fronts. So there was sort of the philosophical front that, there might be folks out there who are unable to access the relative safety of the US. But there's also a very practical perspective, which is that Sullivan's funding is tied to enrollment. And so fewer students means less money, which means potential cuts to their ELL programming, which could harm the students that are already there, not even mentioning the folks that aren't able to make it. So since then, of course, immigration news is fast and furious and updates are all over the place. And so I'm wondering if you have heard anything from the Sullivan team recently and what they're seeing on the ground in terms of, students coming or not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm continuing to do some reporting outside Sullivan, so I've spent a bit of time there this fall, and it is an interesting moment because they're really hopeful now that, especially in the last 48 hours or something, since President Biden announced that he will resettle, they will, not he personally, obviously, but will resettle 125,000 refugees in the next fiscal year, which is, just to measure that against the Trump administration. I think there were under 10,000 refugees resettled in the 2018-2019 fiscal year. So makes a huge difference, and you can really feel that acutely at a place like Sullivan. The first year I was reporting there in 2017, it was actually the last fiscal year under the Obama administration, and they received over 100 new refugees alone at Sullivan, students. And then by the time I finished reporting in 2019, it was 5, maybe, almost none. And so in both the news from the Biden administration and the news coming out of Afghanistan, knowing that there are special immigration visa recipients and parolees who are arriving in the country and in Chicago in coming weeks, means that, they will have new students in the building for the first time in a long time. And it's this funny, strange relationship where a crisis in another part of the world is actually in some ways the thing that can save a program like Sullivan's. And that's just the reality of what you pointed to, that how funding works, and bodies in the building means money for a program like Sullivan. So it's, in a funny way, like a hopeful time, and they're ready. They've built this program, and now they're just waiting for the kids to come.
Well, we're crossing our fingers for them for sure. I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience. So if you're tuned in and you want to post questions in the chat box, please do. But I'll ask you one other question in the meantime, Elly. At the end of the book, you are giving a little bit of background on some questions that you would pose to yourself upon embarking on writing this book. And one of those questions is, what kind of America will they, meaning the refugee students at Sullivan, help to build? And so I'm wondering if you can share with us how you might answer that question today, given the research that you've done and your experience with those students. What kind of What kind of America might they help us build?
Well, I feel like so lucky that I met these young people and that I got to, you know, had access to their dreams and their hopes and their desires, and got to see how in so many ways they are like all teenagers. They want the same things. Even I recognize myself in them. And I've been doing this work long enough that many of them have already graduated from college or are in college and are on their way to be nurses or surgeons or doctors. And also some of them are working and taking care of their families. And I feel as though we're so lucky to have them here. But it also felt important to me to show that they're, wonderful and complicated and messy and beautiful in all the ways that we all are as humans. And, there's sometimes this expectation that, what's often called like the perfect immigrant, and they're human in the ways that we're all human. And that's something to be celebrated too. And that's the world that we all live in. And there are neighbors and our coworkers, and part of writing this book is one of my goals was to help us understand their experiences better so we can be better neighbors to them as well. So I don't know, the America they'll inherit, I hope, is one that we can make sure is welcoming and opening and open, and they'll make it better for us too.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellie. This has been a really fun conversation for me, and I think we'll turn it back over to Annie to field any questions from the folks tuning in.
Hi, thank you both so much. This has been wonderful so far. And we do have a great question here from Carla. So, Carla, I hope you're still here to hear the answer. But if anyone else has a question, now would be the time to put it in the chat. So, Carla says, a specific school of refugees and people of many other nations seems like it would be a recipe for cliques or self-segregation. How does the staff or students deal with unity and encouraging students to intermix? I myself am an immigrant who grew up in the U.S. from the age of 12 on. Well, thank you, Carla. What do you think, Ellie?
Yeah, well, I would say all high schools are spaces that feed into cliques and tribing up in that way. But certainly, I mean, one of the cool things about reporting over a long period of time is that I was actually able to see how that progresses. So certainly when kids first arrive, they tend to stick with, one of the things they do at Sullivan is they have a buddy system. So they pair new students with someone who speaks their language and maybe comes from the same culture, so they feel more welcomed at school. And so when they start, they tend to stick with what they know. So kids from their home country, kids who speak their same language. But over time, as they acclimate and as they become, more engaged in school life and after school activities, that starts to change. And I've seen so many kids who graduate from Sullivan with an entirely different group of friends than where they started. And that's a really wonderful thing to see. But, it's still high school, and it is kind of interesting to see how typical high school dynamics are also layered with, cultural conflict. And that also is happening inside Sullivan too. I mean, I think both are true.
Yeah, fascinating. All right. Well, I think that was our question. Laura, did you have a final question or thought you wanted to hit on the way out?
No final questions, unless, Ellie, there's anything else that you just want to lift up for folks that that haven't had a chance to read the book yet, or one of your main takeaways from this experience.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation and your incredibly thoughtful questions. I so appreciate it. I think what I want people to take away is that Sullivan is this incredible ecosystem where, students and teachers are caring for each other and doing their best to stay afloat. And it, like I mentioned earlier, it's messy and it's wonderful and it's incredibly human, and it's the kind of space that exists in so many places, and there are so many lessons to learn from reading about Sullivan. And I hope that, you know, readers see themselves in the book and see their community in the book, and, you know, see how this is a story not just of a place in Chicago, in a school in Chicago, but it's a bigger American story. It's a story of many generations, and it's a story that will continue to be told and continue to be true for years to come too.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Those of you who are watching, just remember that we do have copies of Refugee High at Majors and Quinn. I've put the phone number for the store into the chat. It's 612-822-4611 if you want to give us a call and order anything for shipping or pickup. Thanks so much, both of you. And again, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.